Okay, so get this right. We're looking at this research, and it's pretty intense. Like, seriously, might need an aspirin after this one. The question is, does COVID infection really triple the risk of heart attacks and strokes even years later? You sent over some really interesting studies in both English and French, so we're going global for this deep dive.
It really is amazing how much research is coming out of the long-term impacts of COVID. These two studies we're focusing on today, they really highlight that this is more than just a respiratory illness. So the first one, it's from the Journal of Clinical Investigation. It looks at dyslipidemia. And the second one, it's published in atherosclerosis, thrombosis, and vascular biology. And this one looks at the risk of major adverse cardiovascular events, like heart attacks and strokes, after a COVID infection.
Okay, so dyslipidemia. Help us out here. What does that even mean? And why should we care?
It's basically an imbalance of fats in your blood, like too much cholesterol, or triglycerides, or even both. And the thing is, you might not even know you have it. There aren't always clear symptoms. But over time, those excess fats can damage your blood vessels. And that sets the stage for serious heart problems later on. And what's concerning is that this study found a 29% increase in the risk of developing dyslipidemia after the pandemic started.
29%. That's a huge jump. Like, what kind of numbers are we even talking here?
Well, even before the pandemic, over half of adults in developed countries, around 53%, they were already dealing with dyslipidemia. So if you add that 29% increase on top of that, we could be looking at close to 70% of adults at risk. It's like a silent epidemic within a pandemic.
Wow, that is a sobering thought. And what makes this research especially strong is they tracked over 200,000 people for 3 years before the pandemic and 3 years after. So we get a really clear picture of how COVID-19 might be changing things when it comes to heart health.
Exactly. This study design helps us see that COVID-19 isn't just happening alongside these heart risks. It's actually contributing to them. And that leads us to that second study, which looked at the likelihood of those major adverse cardiovascular events, the heart attacks, the strokes, and even death, within 3 years of a COVID infection.
And this is where that triple the risk headline comes in.
That's right.
That's got to be pretty alarming for anyone who's had COVID.
It is concerning.
Yeah.
And it emphasizes how long-lasting the impact of this virus can be. So this study found that people who had COVID, they were twice as likely to experience one of these events compared to those who hadn't. And for those who were hospitalized with severe COVID, that risk actually tripled.
Triple, that's massive. You know, we hear about other infections like the flu and how they can maybe cause temporary heart issues. Is this similar to that, or is COVID different?
That's a great question. And it gets to the heart of why these studies are so important. So while other infections can temporarily increase heart risks, COVID's impact seems to be much more persistent. It lasts for years, not just weeks or months.
So it's not just a blip. It could be a lasting change in your heart health.
Exactly. And there's another interesting thing about this study. I think you'll find this interesting. Your blood type might also matter in terms of your risk after a COVID infection.
Hold on. Blood type. Okay, now this is getting really interesting.
Yeah, so the study found that people with non-O blood types, A, B, or AB, they had double the risk of major cardiovascular events after COVID. Compared to those with blood type O, it's kind of unexpected. Researchers are still figuring out why blood type might have this effect, but it just adds another layer of complexity.
So even if you had a mild case, things like your blood type could still be influencing your risk down the line.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to look at everything and consider all these potential factors.
Okay, so we've talked about how COVID-19 seems to be linked to an increased risk of heart problems, even years later. But the big question is why? What's happening in the body that could explain this connection?
Well, researchers are still piecing it all together, but there's a growing focus on something called endothelial dysfunction.
Endothelial dysfunction.
Oh!
That sounds serious. What does that even mean?
So think of the endothelium as the lining of your blood vessels. It's like the Teflon coating on a non-stick pan. It keeps everything flowing smoothly. But when this lining gets damaged or inflamed, that's endothelial dysfunction.
Yeah.
And it can really mess things up.
Instead of a smooth pan, it's more like a rusty one.
Yeah. That's a great way to think about it. And that rust, it can lead to all sorts of problems. Like it can disrupt how your body processes cholesterol, which contributes to that dyslipidemia we talked about. It can also increase inflammation throughout your body, which makes your blood more likely to clot. And those clots, well, they're what cause heart attacks and strokes.
So it's not like COVID is attacking the heart directly. It's more like it's messing with the systems that keep our blood vessels healthy.
Right, exactly. And what's really interesting is that endothelial dysfunction is also involved in a lot of other chronic conditions like diabetes, obesity, kidney disease, some of the things you mentioned from the sources. It's like COVID is taking advantage of something that's already a problem in the body and maybe even making it worse.
So it's like COVID is kicking you when you're already down. If someone already has one of these conditions, could COVID make it even worse?
It's definitely a concern, and it really highlights how important it is to understand these long-term risks. We're talking about a virus that could have a ripple effect, potentially impacting multiple organ systems.
And that makes me think about long COVID. We hear that term a lot, but what does it really mean? And how does it fit into all of this?
Long COVID is basically the bunch of symptoms that some people experience for weeks, months, even years after their initial COVID infection. And these symptoms can be all over the place. Fatigue and brain fog, shortness of breath, chest pain, even changes in taste or smell.
So it's not just a simple get sick, recover, and you're back to normal kind of thing. There can be all these lingering effects.
Exactly. We're still learning about everything that long COVID involves, but the evidence is really piling up that it can have a big impact on people's lives and their overall health.
This all sounds pretty intense, but I know we also want to talk about what people can do about it. So let's talk about post-COVID care and recovery. For anyone listening who has had COVID, what can they do to protect their health and maybe even reduce these long-term risks?
Well, the first step is awareness. Just knowing that these long-term risks exist, it's crucial, especially if you've had COVID. It's not about being scared. It's about being informed and taking steps to manage your health.
So what does that actually look like? What should people be doing differently?
A lot of the advice for preventing heart disease and other chronic conditions applies here. Maintaining a healthy weight, eating a balanced diet, getting regular exercise, managing stress. These are all really important for your overall health, and they might reduce your risk of complications.
So it's not about doing anything totally different. It's about sticking to those healthy habits we already know are important.
Exactly. And it's also about being aware of your body. If you're experiencing any weird symptoms after COVID, or symptoms that just won't go away, don't ignore them. Talk to your doctor. And don't be afraid to advocate for yourself. It's always better to be safe than sorry.
It's easy to think those lingering symptoms are just from stress or being overworked, especially these days. But it sounds like it's really important to take them seriously and not just assume they'll go away on their own.
You got it. And if you have any underlying health conditions, it's even more important to be on top of things. Work with your doctor, make sure you're taking your medications, and don't be afraid to ask questions.
So knowledge is power here. The more you understand about the risks and what you can do about them, the better prepared you'll be. So much to think about from this deep dive. The risk of heart attacks and strokes, long COVID, and that endothelial dysfunction thing. But before we wrap up, I want to shift gears a bit from the what to the now what. What can our listener do with all this information? How can they take charge of their health after COVID?
That's a great question, because knowledge is only powerful if we use it. So let's give our listeners some real steps they can take. We've talked about lifestyle changes, but it's not just about checking things off the list. It's about finding habits you can stick with to support your health in the long run.
So instead of a crash diet or a crazy workout plan, it's more about a lifestyle that helps both your body and mind.
Exactly. And that includes managing stress. We often forget how much stress affects our physical health. When you're stressed all the time, it can lead to inflammation, mess with your sleep, and increase your risk for a whole bunch of problems.
So finding healthy ways to cope with stress, like meditation, or spending time in nature, or connecting with people you care about, that becomes even more important.
Absolutely. And speaking of connection, don't underestimate the power of community. Reach out to friends and family, or even support groups. Sharing your experiences can really help, even the tough ones. It can make you feel less alone.
It's true. It helps to know you're not the only one going through this. And it's not just about emotional support.
Right.
Being part of a community can also connect you with resources and information.
That's right. You might learn about new research, or treatments, or ways to cope that you wouldn't have found on your own.
And don't forget to advocate for yourself. If you're not getting the answers you need from your doctor, don't give up. Get a second opinion. Talk to specialists. Ask questions.
It's your health. You deserve to be in the loop and make the decisions that are right for you.
We've talked a lot about what individuals can do. But there's a bigger picture here, too. We need more research to really understand long COVID and its long-term effects. We need better resources for people who are struggling. And we need a healthcare system that can handle all of this.
I completely agree. This is something we all need to work on together to make things better for everyone.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I hope our listeners are feeling hopeful, not discouraged. Yes, this information can be a lot to take in, but when you know what you're dealing with, you can start taking action.
We're in uncharted territory here, but we're not alone. By learning more, taking care of ourselves, and supporting each other, we can make things better for everyone.
That's a great way to put it. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Remember, knowledge is power, and your health is worth it. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay well.